which we're very grateful to both Dangor Education and the Lyons Learning for helping us fund and support. And we're also grateful to our programme partners, particularly the Jewish News and Haaretz, who are supporting both the emerging journalists, which I'll talk about in a little bit more, and some of their journalists are speaking during the series on our public programme. So let me start off by introducing myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Aviva Dorch. I'm the Executive Director of Jewish Renaissance magazine, which is the UK's national Jewish quarterly, specialising in arts and culture.
Okay,
Our editor, Rebecca Taylor, has really built us up internationally over the last 8 years. And we also, in every issue, cover a different Jewish community around the world and their cultural experiences. So we're now also the leading Jewish arts publication in Europe, and we're placed in institutions across America, Israel, as well as globally, but particularly America and Israel, we're subscribed to by Harvard, University of California, New York University, the National Library of Israel, Bar-Ilan. And that global focus has really become important at this moment in time, because we are obviously based in the UK. We have a UK perspective, but what we're realizing is we are a community globally as the Jewish community. And with what is happening in the Middle East, those connections become more and more important. So this series, Journalism Inside Out, was set to go with our Emerging Journalist programme. We are currently mentoring and developing 26 emerging journalists, emerging Jewish journalists, to help them with their careers. And we thought alongside that we should have a public programme meeting journalists, and they can decide if they're journalists who are Jewish journalists or who happen to be Jewish. We're not defining anybody, but we thought we'd talk to them about their careers and have a public programme exploring all the different facets of journalism. And as we've said for today's session, the today's session title is "What's the Point of Journalism?" Now, we obviously programmed this before October the 7th. We advertised it before October the 7th. And I want to give you a little idea about why we chose the speakers we did, because it was before current events. And I think because of the intention of the programming, but because we're also running this for emerging journalists, I will, as much as possible, hold that original intention, while also knowing that we will obviously talk quite a lot about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. So the 4 speakers, they're going to introduce themselves and their careers much more fully in conversation with me. But we wanted to really give you a different range of journalist experience. So we're starting off with Rafael Behr, who's been a long-time friend of Jewish Renaissance. And in fact, he judged a previous Emerging Journalism Prize that we ran. Rafael has a background as a foreign correspondent from Russia, an expert in Russia and the Baltic. But he then went on to really be a commentator on British politics, including how toxic British politics and writing about politics has become, and strategies for dealing with that. So that's Rafael, and Rafael we're going to start the conversation with in a few minutes. He'll tell you a bit more about his career before we go in depth into his kind of journalism. As well as Rafael, we invited Judith Moritz to join us. Judith Moritz is the BBC's Northern correspondent, and from Rafael's international experience, we wanted someone as well who worked on a more local or regional beat, but on stories that had national impact. And Judith spent a lot of time on our screens over the last year because she was the main correspondent for the Lucy Letby trial for the BBC. So again, we'll have a chat with Judith a little bit later on about her career, but that's the story we might concentrate a little bit more on initially before we expand out. Our next speaker, Hugo Rifkind, might be very familiar to those of you who read the Times, who are, I was going to say Twitterati, but of course now it's X, which means I certainly am on there a lot less often. But who's known very much as a opinion writer, a TV reviewer, and particularly known for his satirical columns. My favourite being how every week you take the voice of someone in the news or a celebrity and create my week from them. Which I know several of those columns became a book that you've published. I just read the one last week or this week, lost complete track of time, on the COVID inquiry. But we wanted to have an opinion writer. So we have an international and political expert, a local and regional expert, and someone who specialises in opinion and feature writing as opposed to news. And the last person we chose to be on the panel for initially two reasons. One, because we did want, as Jewish organisations, to think about Israel, but also because we wanted to think about editing. So the fourth person we invited was Esther Solomon, who is, I'm so grateful, Esther, that you've managed to find the time to join us, because I cannot imagine what your life is like right now. Esther is the editor-in-chief of Haaretz English. The last note I read about you said you were in charge of a newsroom of about 400 journalists. Maybe, I don't know if that's an accurate figure, but that was according to CNN. And obviously your last month has been incredibly full on, and we're very grateful you're joining us. And yes, it would be lovely if along the way you talk about the process of being an editor and running a newsroom, but obviously when we do have questions about the current crisis, Esther, we're going to be directing them your way. And to add to that, that when we initially invited you, part of my thinking was because the last 9 months, Israel had been the base of these massive demonstrations about the current government and about democracy. And I was really interested in how Haaretz was covering that. So obviously there's now a much bigger story, but I don't think we can let that go either. So what I'm going to do is we'll start with a one-to-one conversation with each of you. Invite you to just talk a little bit about your careers, how you started off, how you got to the point you are now, and why the kind of journalism you're doing now is where you found your niche. We'll then bring you all together for a little bit of a conversation about journalism as a whole, and then we'll open up to a Q&A with the audience. So please, if you are listening and you have questions for our panel, write a note in the chat, and then we will have a look at the questions as we go. And later on this evening, we will probably invite you to come on screen and ask the question yourself. Does that sound good? Okay, so let me start off. Thanks to everyone. Let's start off with Rafael, because as well as all your other places you write for JR. And in our current issue, you have this article which talks about your time in Russia, and the moment you sat there and you thought, I'm not just someone who happens to be Jewish, but I am a Jewish journalist. So will you tell us a little bit about that moment and then about your career?
Well, yes, it's interesting because, at that stage, I wasn't actually a journalist. As I said, I was a student who was sort of still trying to work out what I wanted to do for a living. But I thought journalism sounded interesting and exciting, and someone had suggested actually that I could do this trick where you go to the local bureaus and you tout yourself, and it was actually the Guardian who took me in. This was long before I now work for the Guardian as a columnist, but there were many stages in between. But anyway, the story that I've mentioned in that piece of JR, which was very revealing, was about when I arrived as a student, and my landlady, who was a woman, she would have probably been in her 50s then, but in my memory she's about 100, because I'm now in my nearly 50s, so obviously it's my sense of proportion has gone completely askew. But anyway, she arrived, and before I'd even taken my coat off, she said, when she said, well, where are you from? And I said, well, England. I'm English, clearly, that you know that. And she said, well, no, you're not. And I was a bit baffled by this. I thought, well, we can't really have an argument about this because I am. And, and she said, well, look at you though, you had longer hair then, you've got dark curly hair, look at your face, what kind of Englishman are you? Where's your family from? And I, went through the story. I said, well, South Africa. My parents are from South Africa. And I said, well, you're not Africans. Like, no, because they're from Lithuania. So Lithuania, no, well, they're Jewish. So why did you're so Jewish? Why did you say you were English then? And it wasn't really hostile. It was just sort of as if, where I think I wrote it in the piece. It's, it's if like, you ordered a Coke and the waiter says, "Are you okay with Pepsi?" It's like, well, I suppose, but it's not what I actually asked for. And the thing is that this became absolutely routine in Russia, and for reasons that I could go into, but they're very complicated. The Russian sensitivity to the difference between a national identity, a citizen identity, and an ethnic identity is incredibly acute, especially regarding Jews. And so very quickly, it became impossible for me to pass myself off as English or British in that context, because every single conversation you had with everyone, you would get the ethnography out within the first few minutes. I mean, it was just, it was unavoidable. And I sort of stopped minding it after a while and sort of came to accept it. But up until then, I had not thought of it as a sort of a public part of, or a necessary part of, what I would be doing for a living or in a professional context. And then the interesting thing is that it was only actually many years later, because I then went back to the UK, and it was only really when Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, by which point I'd been political editor of the New Statesman. I was quite close to the Ed Miliband era Labour leadership. I'd written a lot about Labour politics. I was a Guardian columnist. My beat was writing all about internal Labour Party politics and Labour Party dynamics. And for reasons that I think will be pretty obvious to absolutely everyone watching this, at that point, it no longer became possible to have this clear distinction between a Jewish component of my identity and the political material I was working with. And I had that same phenomenon happened, of it becoming unavoidably relevant, that yes, I was British, yes, I was writing about politics, but I was also Jewish. And so that, I think, was, and we can talk about how you then manage those processes. But looking back, it's extraordinary, actually, that I went so long without that being a relevant or a necessary sort of tension or relationship that I had to manage.
That's really interesting. I think maybe something we'll bring up a little bit later in the chat between all of you. But one of the things that happened in this time, I mean, you just said, you're relatively young, you're not that much older than I am, but the stress of what you were doing in terms of reporting actually caused you to have a heart attack. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, in fairness, smoking a lot during my 20s and eating 2
Didn't help.
breakfasts a day and having a Ashkenazi cardiovascular disease going back about 5 generations probably had a significant impact. But yes, no, I was incredibly stressed and overweight and unhealthy. And on the New Year's Eve, actually, 2019 to 2020, just after Boris Johnson had won that big election majority, to cut a long story short, I went out for a run and very nearly didn't come back because I had what I believe is clinically known as a massive bloody heart attack. And it became very clear that, to me at least, that even if the stress of what I'd been doing for a living was just a contingent sort of factor in that, it was not going to be easy for me to go back to writing about and reporting on dealing with politics the way I had been before. That I had been I'd been sort of working in a laboratory with a toxic substance, and I hadn't even been wearing gloves or safety goggles. I'd been letting it sort of splash all over my body, and I'd soaked it all up, and I'd let the poison get right into me, and it was making me very as well as unhealthy. It had been making me unhappy, and so and crucially, I wrote a book. So
So
plug for
that's
the
what we
book.
were going to come
We've
to.
done that. Good. Okay. So I don't need to lay that on any thicker. No, I went through this process, in the process of recovering and sort of rehabilitating myself, so I could go back to writing about politics, because I didn't know anything else. I couldn't go off and write columns about cheese or biscuits. I wasn't allowed to eat cheese and biscuits anyway because of the cholesterol. So I had to go back to writing about politics, but it meant I had to engage with it differently, which means I had to try and sort of diagnose what, or sort of do the analytical process of understanding what was in the compound, what was it about that substance that I had absorbed that had poisoned me, that that was so bad, and what was so toxic about it, and how might I handle it differently. And that that became the book and became the sort of mechanism by which I then felt, okay, I can actually still write about politics, but I don't need to let it get quite under my skin so much. Although I have to admit right now is not a good time to put this into practice, but we can come to that.
So I was going to ask just final question to you before I go to some of the others, and then we bring it in we have a real discussion, but don't spoil the book too much because we
No.
want people to buy it. But were there strategies that you feel you're using, that you talk about in the book, that you feel you're really using in the current moment? Or how has it shifted your journalism in that way?
Okay. Well, there are two. The simple one is from the 8th of October, I really stopped looking at Twitter. That is a poisonous environment. And I thought, I know what is going to be being said here, and I don't need to actually expose myself to it. And social media generally. I mean, that is simply creating a distance between myself and things that I know will only enrage me and actually won't inform me, because there are other ways of getting information. That's quite kind of basic one. But actually the other one, which I think is more interesting, is a sort of psychological insight about what it is that animates people's sense of outrage and fury, when not just because it's been driven by social media algorithms, but actually, when an issue becomes so fused with someone's sense of identity that they take a sort of a countervailing or a dissenting opinion, and they experience it as a personal threat. And that stimulates your kind of fight or flight sort of caveman adrenaline response, which deactivates a lot of rational functions. So, I mean, I could go on about this at length. I won't. But essentially, what I found that very useful to understand is that even when there are things that I see that upset me or distress me, or people expressing things that would once have just made me so incredibly angry at either the stupidity of it or the naivety of it or the sheer wrongness of it, I am now better at sort of, the act of empathy, that you can empathize with someone who's holding what I consider to be a very wrong or appalling opinion, without indulging it rationally. Do you see what I mean? That there's a distinction there, and you can understand the psychological and emotional process and get some kind of distance from it. And I find that incredibly important, because otherwise you get sucked into the vortex of fury.
Okay. Well, that's a really important thing to hold on to. I know for a lot of us at the moment who are being sucked into the vortex, all sorts, not just fury, but of trauma, I think, right now. So I think that's something we'll definitely come back to in conversation with the others. But I wanted to pull out that point about searching for empathy, because as a journalist, you spent a long time trying to understand your subjects. And communicate their viewpoints. I want to bring in Judith Moritz on that, because you've spent the last few months reporting on a subject who, as you then wrote an article about, you found absolutely impossible to understand in terms of what was going on behind what she did. So, Judith, shall we have over to you? Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that Lucy Letby trial and how you worked on it? Oh, we need you to unmute. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. Lucy Letby, don't really know where to start. And that was kind of the point of the piece you're referring to on the BBC website, was that I'd spent the best part of a year watching her as part of my coverage of that trial. And I was asked by editors at the end to try to write some sort of profile of what I'd made of her. And it dawned on me that, having spent all of that time in court, I was no closer to fully understanding her character and personality, and that formed the basis of the piece. It was one of a whole range of things that I worked on to coincide with the end of the trial, including a panorama documentary, which took a very different perspective. But that personal journey of following the trial and watching her was something that I took a bit of time over to write from a personal point of view. So, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, that case. I could talk about it for a long time. I can't actually talk about it as fully as I'd like to, because there's a fresh reporting restriction which has been put into place by the court, which it doesn't prevent me from discussing it completely, but there will be a retrial on one of the charges that the jury couldn't decide on. And so because of that, the court has restricted the extent to which I can get into detail, or any reporter can get into detail around the evidence that we heard in the first case. But don't worry, it doesn't mean I can't get into anything.
Well, let's hold the case for now and focus on you, because how did you develop a career that took you to this point? And what was it originally that drew you to the Northern beat, that kind of put you in the pole position to be the reporter on the case?
Well, so I grew up in Manchester. I'm a proud Northerner, Mancunian. So to give you a quick potted history of my career, I suppose I first became interested in journalism when I liked English at school. I liked writing. I went to an English degree at UCL. I joined the student newspaper there, London Student, now defunct, sadly, I think. Certainly a print copy of it no longer exists. But it was a real hotbed when I was there. That the other students that I was meeting through that paper have gone on to careers, broadcast careers in The Guardian and other papers. So it was a place that we all came together as kids, really, and learnt the trade. In the olden days, the mid-90s, there was a dark room where we were printing photographs the old way. It was pre-digital, really, quite old-fashioned. And yeah, that was where I got the bug. I started a journalistic career in terms of broadcast when I left university, and I got onto the BBC's graduate training scheme, which was running then. And they, as part of that application process, they asked you if there was anywhere that you didn't want to go and work, and you knew that if you ticked any of the boxes geographically, that would be that, no dice. So you had to say, yeah, I'll go anywhere. And they sent me to Norwich. So no disrespect to any of you who may be joining us from East Anglia. I loved it, actually, as it turns out, but I'd never been. All I knew about Norwich is that's where Alan Partridge was from. And so I schlepped off to work for Look East in the east of England, and I stayed there for quite a few years, learning the trade, local news, local radio, even CFAX, if you remember that. That was when I first started print journalism, was writing pages for CFAX. Then I travelled around the UK. I worked for the BBC in a range of different jobs in different places beyond the east of England, but I wanted to come back up to the north, really, for family reasons. I settled and married here, have kids, and it's where I wanted to live as an adult. So I've been working as a North of England correspondent. So that's for all of the BBC's national and international news programmes, the World Service TV, 6 o'clock news, 10 o'clock news, the Today programme, all of that, plus the website, all of the network and national programmes, covering news from the north of England, which has national merit, essentially. The north of England, by the way, depending on who has control of the newsroom map, has very expandable borders. I mean, I've been all over the place, but essentially I'm based in Manchester, and I predominantly work around the northwest.
Did the BBC shifting to Salford have an impact, do you think, on the kind of coverage the North got and how your career took off?
Yeah, well, it did for me, because I was working for the BBC in the North before that. And really, the suggestion was always that if you wanted to make it big in national news, you'd have to go down to London. And that's no longer necessarily the case. The BBC's moved thousands of staff in different departments and areas up to Salford, meaning that just as I was thinking I might have to make that break, the jobs and the opportunities widened in Manchester and around Media City. So that's been great. The timing for me couldn't have been better. But the other thing, is, and I would say this because I'm biased really about this patch, but it's, I think, the newsiest patch out of London in the UK. So, or certainly within England. So, if you think about the number of stories, it's the density of the population. It's Manchester and Liverpool and Leeds and Sheffield. It's there's a lot of sport. There's a lot of crime, which I've found myself doing, a lot of court cases. It just generates a lot of news. We have terrible weather, so every year I get stuck doing that. It meant I was going to be busy, and that's the one thing I think probably all journalists have in common, is nobody wants to be sitting there not covering a story. We live for the stories. It's the adrenaline of getting out and being busy. and some of the stuff that I've covered over the years, particularly long-term stories like Hillsborough, which I've spent years covering, the aftermath of that, the Manchester Arena bombing, those sorts of stories, the complexity of them, the length of them, and the sort of my appetite for getting involved in something which was going to take a lot of energy and focus is really what I'm about. So in terms of that sort of material as a patch, for me, the north of England really couldn't be better.
Fantastic. Speaking as someone who grew up in Manchester, I'm all for the primacy of the north of England. But what we'll do is we'll come back to you a little bit later on with that idea of news reporting, both local and national, and I think particularly broadcast. And what does it mean when you are covering some of those big stories like Hillsborough, like the Manchester Arena bombings, like the Lucy Letby trial. So thank you so much for joining us, Judith. Our next speaker, Hugo Rifkind, also has his roots in the north, I believe, and in Scotland too. Although you're not so much someone who's getting out there to report on different news stories, but commentating in a very different kind of way. Do you want to talk a little bit, Hugo, about your background and career, and then what it is you do now? Oh, if you unmute.
There we are. Yes, I grew up in Edinburgh. I moved to London when I was about 20. So I got started in journalism to the extent that I'm in journalism. No, I am. I shouldn't be so rude about myself. I'm definitely in journalism. I got started in journalism. I got a job with a gossip news website in about 1999. Because my flatmate was temping next door. I was trying at the time to write novels. In fact, was at the time writing my first novel. My second novel is due out next year, so that tells you how quickly I write novels. And he gave them my CV to this gossip news website, and I wrote funny stuff for them for about 6 months, and then I was, I guess, basically spotted by a commissioning editor from the Times, and started writing features in the Times, but silly features about haircuts and celebrity trends and things like that, which I did for quite a few years. And I started writing a bit for Scottish newspapers as well. I wrote a little bit for the Evening Standard. I wrote for a few magazines. Eventually, after about 5 or 6 years of that, I took over the gossip diary in the Times, then called the People column, from a man called Andrew Pearce. Was keen to get rid of it and been told he wasn't allowed to get rid of it until he found somebody to give it to. So he gave it to me. I knew nothing about how to get gossip diary stories. And indeed, frankly, still don't. And I thought it was a job I'd do for a few months. And I did it for about 5 years, I think. And I didn't enjoy it at all, any bit of it at all. It's a miserable job going to... it sounds fun going to sort of celebrity parties and speaking to famous people, but they always, forgive the language, but they always want you to piss off. And so you never really... It's not a rewarding way to spend your time, being sort of meeting your idols and being told to go away by them. But because I loathed doing it so much, I managed to persuade the then Saturday editor to let me write something very different, Friday for Saturday, which was a fictional diary in the voice of a person in the news, which is this column called My Week, which I thought they'd let me do for a month or two. And that was in 2006, and I'm still doing it. So it's become quite a long-running column. So I still write that. At various points I've wanted to stop writing it and they've never let me, which I'm incredibly grateful for, because I've actually enjoyed doing it more and more. I also write an opinion column on Tuesdays. I write a TV column on Saturdays. I write editorials for the paper frequently. I used to do that 4 days a week, and I do it 1 or 2 days a week. And I present a show on Times Radio, which few of the audience here, I'd imagine, will have heard because it goes out on Saturday mornings, but you can download it and listen to it later. And I write other features as and when they let me as well. Oh, and I was a columnist for The Spectator for about 10 years in the middle.
Just a brief thing you almost forgot.
Brief 10 years.
Yeah. I'm going to think a little bit about My Week. I mentioned you've just done one on the COVID inquiry, but although it is satirical, you use it to really make quite major political points, and a bit like Rafael, kind of covering both the current government and shadow, like the Labour Party and shadow cabinet. I was very interested to see that it's not just your words in the Times that have impact, but how you then amplify them using social media. And I have seen quoted absolutely everywhere your comments on Suella Braverman recently. I mean, she was your subject for my week a few weeks ago, but after the failure of multiculturalism comment that she made, you said, you made this comment on Twitter that Braverman is a British Home Secretary descended from Goan Indians from Mauritius and Kenya, married to a Jewish husband in a government headed by Britain's first Hindu MP. What would successful multiculturalism look like? And not only did that resonate with so many people, but as I said, it kind of went exponential. I've literally seen hundreds of people quote it, including some very high profile journalists. So how do you use that balance between writing for outlets such as the Times or the Spectator versus finding your own voice on social media to amplify them? Or what is the relationship between your use of the different kinds of media?
It's sort of the other way around. I use social media as a notebook that talks back. So any idea, generally speaking, any idea that I would express in a tweet is something I have not yet written a column about, and perhaps thinking about writing a column about. I'll put it out there. I'll see where it goes. I'll see what the pushback to it is like and whether that spurs further thoughts. The first time I realized I could do this, actually, I wrote quite a lot whenever I forget how long ago it was now, but when the Cameron government brought in equal marriage, I tweeted about that before writing about it. I was eventually honored with a Stonewall Award for writing about that, because I was one of the most sort of vociferous journalists about it. But that was the first time I realized what you could do with Twitter. Twitter wasn't quite as mad then as it is now, but I realized then that you could just explore the arguments around a topic. And the columns I wrote about that topic were very much informed by, I'd state a position, people would try and counter the position. I'd realize how you got around that counter of the position, or how you could convince people who didn't agree with the position. So it was very much a kind of, it's like a warm up before a fight, right? It's like the sparring you do in the ring before you start boxing, is how I use it when I'm using it in a healthy way, not quite how I use it when I'm using it in a sort of mad, compulsive, for God's sake, stop doing this, it's worse than smoking type way. And I must admit, I do both.
You need to read Rafael's book, clearly.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, I have, but I need to read it again. Yes.
But just in terms of that last comment before we move on, you've made a career not out of being a foreign correspondent or a news reporter. I mean, I'm saying that out of not because it's often something you fall back on, this kind of different tonal context, the way you set yourself out as an opinion writer. You often will bring in personal anecdotes or a very different way to colour your pieces. But in the current time, you are publicly known as a Jewish journalist. How have you found it? Kind of, have you been forced to confront? Have you chosen to confront? Have you taken on what's happening in Israel, and how has it inflected your experience and your work?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm very fortunate in the way I get to write, in the way I'm allowed to write. The sort of the key to the way I write is, I think that the sort of journalism I wanted to do when I first started thinking about doing journalism isn't what I ended up doing. I wanted to write more for magazines. I wanted to do music journalism. These were the sort of things that informed me. In a way, it says something to do with the sexism, the male privilege in our industry. That if I was a writer exactly as I write now, but I was a woman, then earlier on in my career, I would be nudged onto the features pages, nudged onto the fashion pages, only writing about lifestyle. There's no shame in that. Brilliant people write those sorts of pieces. I, indeed, myself quite often write those sorts of pieces. But I think there's an element of male privilege in the way that I also get to write serious opinion pieces as well, and editorials and things like that, which is something I reflect on quite often. In terms of how the news at the moment has affected the way I write, I haven't written about the news at the moment. I've tweeted about it. I've discussed it extensively on the radio, both on Radio 4 and on my own show. There are both personal and circumstantial reasons why I haven't written about it. One major reason why I haven't written about it is my column appears on a Tuesday, and I'm on the same pages as Melanie Phillips, who lives in Jerusalem, William Hague, who used to be Foreign Secretary, and Giles Corran, who is a bigger and better Jew than I am. So in a way, there hasn't been that much space for me to do so. I will eventually. I find it a very difficult topic to write about for, I think, maybe unhealthy, maybe the opposite reasons than I ought to, that I'm very conscious of how my Jewishness, and I'm not a practicing Jew. I'm not an observant Jew. I married out. My kids are not Jewish. I was raised Orthodox after a fashion in Edinburgh, but I'm not practicing today. But I'm very conscious of how my Jewish background impacts the way I want to write about it, and I don't quite trust my own views. And so it's something I'm very consciously sitting on for a few weeks until I'm aware that I'm sure I think what I think, and until I have balanced up the extent to which whatever I wanted to write would both upset people who weren't in the community and people who were in the community, because I have a lot of close family in the community. That kind of thing weighs very heavily on my mind. It's not often, I think quite seriously about everything I write, which might sound odd for a essentially humorous writer, but I do take my opinions quite seriously. And this is one in various angles, I'm just not quite there yet.
Okay. Which is really interesting, because on the one hand, it speaks to, I think, the way many British Jews are feeling, that it is very hard to say anything.
Well, I mean, the flip side of that is the sense of I was going to say fury is too strong a word, but maybe it's not. The flippancy with which many people approach this issue, many other journalists approach this issue. Journalists who, look, I don't live in Israel. I have a lot of family and friends who live in Israel. I don't myself live in Israel. But people who, from my perspective, have zero dog in this fight, seem to feel entitled to sound off in a way that I, with every kind of dog in this fight, would be very wary to do so. And that makes me grind my teeth. Yes,
absolutely. And I'm really glad you said that, because I think that's something that I've been very aware of as well. We are a Jewish magazine, but we're an arts and culture magazine. And one of the things I keep saying to people is we're publishing urgent voices, we're publishing creatives who want to respond to the crisis, but I keep sending people elsewhere for news and holding back, because we need to think about and take time to reflect on how we frame things. What I'm very aware of is, on the one hand, that comes from fear. And I don't know if anyone else was near Liverpool Street Station a couple of hours ago, but there was a massive protest that absolutely filled the station. And just standing outside it felt pretty scary. And I'm someone who knows that a lot of those protesters are actually people who don't understand and just think they're campaigning for peace. But there is an atmosphere at the moment that's scary. But on the other hand, it is a privilege we have in the diaspora that people in Israel we know don't have. And I'm going to, if it's okay, just pass on to Esther, because not only has she not had that privilege of time or space, but you've been writing through trauma, as you said, and I've seen many of your journalists say you all know people who were affected by the October the 7th massacres, who know people who were hostage or families of hostages, and you have been reporting on a minute-to-minute responsive basis, as well as handling a newsroom. I mean, you are managing a staff who I would imagine are living through incredible stress. So thank you. I can only say it again, thank you for taking the time to still do this. I can't quite believe you kept to the commitment. But will you tell us a little bit about how a girl from, I think it's London, I saw you went to St Paul's, to LSE, how you ended up being editor-in-chief of Haaretz, and how you are dealing with the current moment? Let me... Can you unmute? There we go.
Thank you for that introduction. Well, okay, we'll do the biographical stuff first. Yes, born and bred in London, went to Cambridge and LSE, and came to Israel at the end of 1998, which, for those of you who are not yet born, was it was a pretty different atmosphere in the Middle East at that time. There was all sorts of talk that we might be going for long weekends to Aleppo. It gives you some idea about the difference in the geopolitical world of then and now. Actually, I didn't have a burning interest to jump into journalism for quite a few years. I actually did quite a lot of work. I did some NGO work, more Middle East based stuff, quite a lot of writing, quite a bit of editing, and came into journalism from the editor's door, not the reporter's door, editing what was then the very exciting world of blogs, which kind of sounds kind of quaint in these days. We had quite a thriving blog ecosystem that I was building up, different kinds of Jewish voices from around the world, a different kind of writing style and different kind of span of subjects and different kinds of participants to those who often formerly were recognized in Jewish or Israeli journalism. And then through various incarnations became the opinion editor for Haaretz English, which was a new position because previously we'd really more or less been just kind of glorified translators of whatever Haaretz Hebrew used to publish. And then again, it was a different kind of initiative to bring a new, slightly more independent identity to the opinion pages as well, to give some kind of expression to the breadth of ideas and identities and political viewpoints, not just from within Israel, but how Jews outside Israel saw Israel, how Israel related to them, more generally, US-Israel relations, everything to do with Israel's relationship with the outside world and how the outside world related to it. So I stayed there for about basically 10 years and became editor-in-chief about a year and a half ago, which has been quite a busy year and a half, I have to say. And no one actually told me it was going to be like this when I took on the job.
So do you want to talk us a little bit through, before we get to right now, the last 3 weeks, what the last 9 months have been like? And particularly because, and I'm just going to make a caveat to our audience, because as I said, we created this series before the war. We've invited people throughout the next 6 weeks to talk on a variety of subjects, including Israel. But when the notification for today's event came out, I did get some backlash of people going, why is it Haaretz speaking about Israel? I even had a query from someone about, isn't Haaretz anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist? That was my response as well. I don't feel you are either, and that's why we invited you. Absolutely don't think you are either, and I'm going to obviously give you space to say that. But I just want to say you are one of a series of Israeli newspapers. In Hebrew, there are many others. You did Achronot, Maariv, many others. In English, there's Jerusalem Post, for example, which we actually do have speakers from later. But Haaretz has quite a specific perspective. It has been seen as the kind of more left-wing Israeli paper. And both in Hebrew and English, you have not been shy about critiquing the government. And with 9 months of protests against Netanyahu, against Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, Haaretz has really kind of come into its own in terms of opinion as well as news. So how has those 9 months been? And then after that, how have the last 3 weeks been?
Well, I think probably in terms of the protest period, you could say, in Dickens' words, it was the best of times and the worst of times. In some ways, there was a very heavy feeling that we were staring into the abyss of a potentially autocratic future, which we had seen played out in other countries. So it wasn't as if we didn't know the steps. And in fact, we had plenty of commentary and conversations with people from other countries where exactly this process had happened. So Haaretz, which defines itself actually as the liberal paper, yes, that it's in favor of two states and it's anti the occupation, which is why people may sometimes consider it to be lunatically left-wing, but that is certainly not how it defines itself. In some ways, the last 9 months, it was a period of where instead of us being sometimes the outlier voice, the majority of Israel kind of came closer to us, or we found common purpose and unity of kind of vision in terms of upkeeping the central tenets of liberal democracy together. It was a depressing time because you're basically it's very, very difficult to separate out the fact that you are a citizen of the country and a journalist observing it and commentating on it. And in fact, it's a very similar situation now where that the difference between the personal and the political, the news and the personal can be very, very difficult to make, even though that's, supposed to be one of the cardinal tenets of journalism, that there is some space there. In Israel, it's always been quite a pressured space. And definitely during the democracy protests, that was also the case. It was an extremely charged period of 9 months of constantly being tied to the news in a way that was much more intensive than usual, because there were not only weekly protests, sometimes there were daily protests, sometimes there were, we got into a kind of Trumpian style outrage cycle where the government or its ministers or its advisors would constantly throw more and more ludicrous and sometimes a bit intimidating or unpleasant statements or policy positions, just throw them out. And it was constantly a bit of a struggle to understand how much to react to them, how much of it was kind of playing to their base, how much of it was actually serious and they would actually back it up with action. It also was a very, very steep learning curve for many people in terms of understanding what some of the ideas of constitutional democracy were, and how the Supreme Court works, and how fragile actually many of the rights that we thought were more solid could be. And there was also the sense that even though it was in fact definitely a majority of Israelis, at least by the end of the period, that were towards the protest camp, at least the Netanyahu government side was very, very vociferous and intimidating in many ways, and potentially violent as well. And we saw kind of the first sparks of that in some of the later protests. Constantly you're trying to give some kind of sense of what's going on the streets, and what was absolutely unprecedented and quite incredible mass movement for democracy, at the same time as you know, needing to keep to account the government and all the other things that it was doing, you know, not least in the West Bank and many other places as well.
So come October 7th, you've spent 9 months on the brink of exhaustion, actually, covering what feels like an existential crisis for Israel in terms of the democracy of its structures. And then I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but from my research, your daughter is in the Air Force, and it was she who notified you that something extraordinarily awful was happening. And obviously in that moment everything changes. So how did that day unfold for you, and how has it impacted your last 3 weeks as editor of Haaretz?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, we are a reasonably modern Orthodox family. So in general, we try to keep off things that buzz over Shabbat and the Chagim. But that morning, things started buzzing very, very early. And she was getting this entire stream of things. So I realized really within about, I don't know, 10 minutes that this wasn't just going, you know, another wave of rockets or whatever. And we also got an air raid pretty early on in the day as well. So obviously things were heating up in Tel Aviv as well, where I live. So it unfolded in a deluge, but also very, very incomplete, because formal news coverage took a while to get into action, because, you know, it was a holiday weekend. It wasn't like there were kind of the reporters were necessarily in place, although actually and so many of the early reports obviously came out on social media, so that was the way that most people found out. We very soon realized that we had our own journalists, not just in the line of fire, but in the fire, basically. My colleague Amir Tibon, who was my deputy until 6 months ago, lives on the kibbutz of Nachal Oz, which is right next to Gaza. And he and his wife and 2 very small girls basically were locked in their safe room on the kibbutz for 10 hours, where they could hear the Hamas terrorists shooting out their house and everything else that was going on in kibbutz, where, you know, many, many people were killed or abducted. And it's an incredible story about how he was actually rescued by his father, who's an ex-general, who drove down. You know, there were these a whole series of quite unbelievable stories of kind of DIY rescues by off-duty or retired army types, in the absence of the army itself really managing to get itself together in time, or the government actually offering immediate help. Now, in terms of, so then, in fact, that was the first time I'd ever driven into work on a Shabbat or Chag. So kind of baptism of fire on that level. But basically, that was that day did set somewhat the tone of how it's been so far. So on the one hand, we were frantically gathering reports from our journalists who had actually already started fanning out to these various places and trying to get reports to find out that our own colleagues were still, you know, alive. One of the reporters who went down ended up kind of driving down a road, and Hamas terrorists basically started shooting up the whole line of cars that were in front of him, and he survived, but, you know, he was sending us the photos of the bullet holes off his car, and that was at the same time as we were, you know, trying to keep the news flow going. I think that what it was the most extraordinary characteristic of the last 3 weeks is the fact that you know, this very pressured space between being a citizen and a journalist was very, very difficult, because so many people, and in Haaretz, which is just one example of one newsroom, you know, and it's replicating itself in workplaces across Israel and many other kinds of social networks and spaces. Obviously, you know, there are so many people that were personally affected, you know, on a family basis, let alone a friend circle or anything like that. There are at least 4 or 5 people that I know here who lost close members of their family, and that I spoke to one of them a couple of days later, where their elderly parents actually survived, but other family members didn't, or were taken hostage. And she said, don't ask me anything about how I'm feeling, because the only way I can get through every day is to completely disconnect when I get to work. But I'm this person at work, and then when I get home, just I kind of collapse. But that's you know, that's something that some people are capable of doing and some aren't. You know, there are people who, in between their work, are going to funerals 2, 3, 4 times a week, and now there's another level of complication, because now that Israel has solidifying its ground incursion into Gaza, now there's been this enormous call up of the reserves. You know, 350,000 people have been called up, which means pretty much everyone knows someone who is not necessarily in Gaza or at the gates of Gaza, but, you know, a good proportion of people do know people who are certainly in combat positions and, you know, potentially at risk as well. So, you know, whether it's their partners or their kids, depending on their age range or their it's kind of a difficult thing to kind of express for a country that is 6-7 times bigger, like the UK, although, you know, people are used to saying, oh, Israel's so small, it's the size of Wales, and that was always what, you know, one of those talking points. But genuinely, it is a place where people are very networked together in different ways, and the geographical space between places is just not very big either. So the degree of familiarity with the places and the people is just that much greater. It also makes, you know, some very difficult and sensitive decisions about how we cover the war. Obviously, on the one hand, we have I think one of our major problems, obviously, and shared by all Israeli outlets, is we have no independent source of reporting from within Gaza. You know, that's a major issue, but there's also an issue between how much the Israeli public itself wants to know about what's going on in Gaza and how it is relating to what's going on in Gaza. And these are very, very delicate and difficult decisions at this point. Also, you know, all of those other issues about how do you constantly keep up the pressure on a prime minister that you hold responsible for Israel's lack of preparedness, at the same time as he's the person managing the war as well. There's lots and lots of very strange and difficult contradictions that we're living through. For instance, also, going back to the pro-democracy protests, how do you champion liberal democratic protest rights in wartime? This is something that, many states in the West have tried to grapple with and not always come out the right way either. There's definitely rising intimidation of the Arab-Israeli community here now. There is more pressure on freedom of speech and what is considered to be expressions of support for the other side. We're not talking about waving Hamas flags, but there's talk of anything that undermines national morale, which is a bit like those posters from the Second World War in the UK. But these are very difficult questions.
And as a Haaretz reader, something I've been very aware of is how you are covering the settler violence in the West Bank as well. Those are really big issues, and I mean, there's so much to unpack. We could be speaking for hours more, but I'm very aware we are within a context here. What I will flag up to everyone in the audience is that in 5 weeks' time, so our 6th and final session, we are focusing solely on reporting on Israel for both Jewish and non-Jewish outlets. We'll have the managing editor of the Jerusalem Post there, but we'll also have Anshul Pfeffer, one of your Haaretz columnists, speaking, as well as some British reporters, Jonathan Friedland, Richard Farrow from the Jewish News, and we're hoping to also have Shira Rubin from the Washington Post. So we'll definitely be bringing Haaretz back into that conversation and talking about Israel. But we have about 10 to 15 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is bring everybody on screen. You're all journalists and you might well have questions for each other. I know our audience also has some questions for you. And I think what I might do is just, rather than directing any question at a specific person, I'm going to take questions that are more general or ask more general questions myself and allow us just for the next 10, 15 minutes, just to have a kind of conversation amongst ourselves, and as much as we can, as well as thinking about obviously Israel and anti-Semitism, just think about, what's the point of journalism, as this title was, and kind of broader questions about the personal and the political. I think that's been the theme that's come up again and again. How, as a journalist, you deal with integrating or separating those two things, and also possibly about how journalism has changed with this 24-hour news cycle and this constant, what feels like, pressure as well. So I'm going to let you guys think about those things, because there might be something that you want to say in response. But while you are having a moment to think, I'm going to bring Rachel Cousins on screen. Rachel Cousins is one of our emerging journalists cohort, our young journalists, and she, I know, has a question for you guys. So Rachel, if we can ask you to unmute.
Hi guys, thank you so much. That was so interesting. My question actually mostly came about when Rafael was first speaking, but I suppose it's something that might be relevant to all of you. And it was about specifically social media. So I have a sense of bias because I'm a social media journalist myself, but the sort of protection of your mental health and not being able to be in those toxic environments, how do you deal with the guilt you feel as someone with a platform and who can use that platform to spread important information, especially about Jewish people, when there's so much misinformation about us out there? How do you sort of deal with that guilt of actually saying, no, I need to step back for myself and sort of unshoulder some of that responsibility when I suppose Jewish people have been so scrutinized and persecuted and we're such a small group? At what point can you kind of justify it to yourself, asking from a very personal perspective of wanting to understand how I can do that better, I suppose? mute myself again.
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can. Well, I suppose what I would say, and I've been pretty quiet on social media recently for similar reasons to those that Rafael outlined. But I'm very proud to be a Jewish journalist, but my Judaism and my journalism have always been very separate things. You know, I cover the north of England, not the north of Israel. It's my use of social media, and mostly Twitter, X, has been linked. If I'm using it related to stories I'm doing professionally for work, like the Lucy Letby trial, like Hillsborough, like other stories that I would be covering normally on other platforms. So I don't feel that sense of guilt as you've outlined it, because it's just a very separate thing. I use my socials for a very specific purpose and not for anything else. I try not to engage in discourse with people who want to mouth off. I get plenty of that, but I just, that's not what I'm there for. So I feel quite secure in the way I've delineated things.
Right. Rafael. Oh.
Yeah, wasn't allowed to unmute myself. I think so. This is a really interesting question, and it relates to, so I was really struck by something Hugo said also about sort of wanting to wait until you know what you're going to say, or how to articulate a view. And I think I slightly learned the hard way, that ultimately it's an illusion that you can win this argument on social media, or even that you sort of broadcasting what you feel to be the right position is really doing anything at all. I mean, it's doing something, but I've done a fair amount of research on this, partly because of the book and other things that I've done, about the way radicalization online works and the way online communication works. And there's pretty strong evidence that certainly directly engaging with people who are antagonistic to your view really does only feed the hostility and accelerate the polarization. Almost certainly, it's an illusion that you can somehow win. All you can really do, and certainly the recommendation is to, as much as possible, just share good information. And I mean, I think so. Twitter or X, whatever, is a very good example of is a very clear indication of how this works. Even if you sort of retweet the thing that you don't like with the comment saying this is terribly wrong and bad, in practice, all that is doing is amplifying the wrong thing and increasing the audience for that. And there's very strong evidence for that. Now, from my point of view, because I do, I've sort of wound down my Twitter use anyway, and because under Elon Musk, I don't really want to be toiling for free in his anger mines anyway. I just think it's a toxic product. But I am conscious, certainly, that I haven't been out there saying things or sharing things about what's been happening in the last few weeks. I've written one column in this area, but again, like Hugo, I'm sort of sitting on it a bit. And I have felt, I know what you mean about that guilt, thinking, well, someone's got to do something about all the wrongness out there. But I would just say there are better ways to do that, or there are things that are good things that you can just share, and putting more of yourself into that space. You're sort of making yourself an emotionally vulnerable human shield to some terrible things that will hurt you. And it's okay, actually, to look out for number one in that environment, because actually that the way that social media space works is just simply not conducive to achieving the end you would want to achieve through it. Does that make sense?
I mean, if I could add to that, I think it's really important. Never let anyone tell you that you're obliged to share an opinion. My editor's allowed to tell me that because I'm an opinion columnist and it's literally my job. But in real life, it's a ceaseless thing. People can always attack other people for what they haven't said. Oh, I noticed you said nothing about X, but you said nothing. But you said something about Y. That's endless. You can't enter into that world. Otherwise, your life just becomes a series of pronouncements about things you believe in, just to make sure nobody attacks you for not having said so. So I mean, if you don't want to say something, don't say it.
Okay. I'm going to move on because we've got lots of questions coming at us, but I think it's excellent advice, and to all our emerging journalists, please take note of that. I want to go to Arturo, who's again one of our emerging journalist cohort. Arturo's asked 2 questions. Actually, I'm going to ask you just to focus on your second question about Ukraine, because I think we don't have enough time to really take 2 from you. So Arturo, if you can come on screen, and if you'll just kind of ask that. I know it's to Esther, but really I think it's to everybody, really.
Yes, thank you. Well, my question is, how has the style of commentary on the Ukraine conflicts, how has that tone of commentary in the West influenced, or perhaps harmfully or not, the way in which the current conflict in the Middle East is covered? I don't know how it is in Israel, but I think that in the West, perhaps there's a similar tone and tenor.
Are you thinking about the binary good and evil of Russia and Ukraine, and the kind of post-colonialism kind of discourse, which often isn't helpful too?
The suspicion around something like diplomatic aid, for example, the suspicion towards any diplomatic effort, that specifically I'm thinking of.
Okay.
The maligning of any kind of, and yes, what you just mentioned, of course.
Okay, brilliant. Maybe we'll go to Esther.
Well, there obviously should be a big sign saying this is very dangerous territory the moment that someone starts playing with analogies between different parts of the world where the conflicts have very little to do with each other. But it was obviously inevitable that that would happen, because these are 2 conflicts that are taking place at the same time. Funnily enough, what happens on social media and what happens in that dangerous space called real life are a bit different in this aspect, because I can see that there seems to be some kind of tendency to say that the Palestinians are Ukraine and Israel is Russia. But then when you speak to a lot of Ukrainians, they identify very, very strongly with Israel. And in fact, after 1 week of conflict, we were offered an opinion piece by Andrei Yermak, who's Zelensky's kind of chief of staff, who wrote that we totally understand what Israel is going through, because we feel that we have been attacked in the same manner, and some of the same atrocities were committed against us as Hamas committed against Israelis. And he said, in that piece, that we consider Bucha, which is obviously the site of a Russian atrocity against Ukrainians, the same as Re'im, which is where this music party was, where hundreds of young people were mown down. So I don't think the analogy works particularly well, whichever way you want to play it, but it's inevitable that it's going to that's the lexicon that we have.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring Danny Port on, who has a question for you all about influencer journalists. So Emma, can you spotlight Danny for us? And let me ask Danny to unmute.
Hi.
Hi, Danny.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So I wanted to ask about how we deal now with like the fallen trust of journalists and like authority, and the rise of like social media influencers who are acting as journalists without the necessary like professionalism and experience. And so now we have things like government evidence, especially from Israel, that's questioned. Yeah.
I'm actually going to hold on the Israel thing for a moment, because I think that's a really interesting question, Danny, about expertise versus kind of the voice of the influencer. And I know, Judith, when you were covering the Lucy Letby trial, there was this media storm around it, but there was also a huge amount of that kind of influencer journalism. And even I've seen you post comments on your LinkedIn where people have replied going, but she's not guilty, and trying to kind of scrutinize the evidence from their knowledge base. So how do you as a professional journalist deal with the kinds of lack of trust in journalism as a profession and in expertise?
I mean, the influencer thing is a kind of growing phenomenon. It's not just been the Letby case. I covered the Nicola Bulley story, you know, that the woman who sadly died in a river in Lancashire earlier this year. That attracted all these kind of true crime buffs who are coming down to the river filming for their own kind of, it was like the Wild West down there. That was really bizarre. I've had it on a story to do with a baby who's very sadly dying at Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool. There was a right to die case involving a child called Alfie Evans. We had bloggers and people doing Facebook lives down in the kind of media scrum with the accredited journalists mixing in amongst us. At Letby, there was a whole world. There's still a whole world, you just touched on it, of kind of all sorts of corners of the internet are full of people who are purporting to be journalists or even not, but just writing op-ed pieces, opinion pieces, and putting stuff out there, which incidentally the judge in that trial was really aware of, and he kept talking. You know, there was weeks of for various reasons of legal arguments in the run-up to that case involving journalists from accredited organizations, and the judge who was making decisions around reporting restrictions had to make a distinction between us and between people online who were writing whatever the heck they liked, because he can't control everybody. But ultimately, he made the point, and that there have been some cease and desist notices sent out to some of those folk who are writing, putting posts out there, that they could be hauled up in front of him for contempt of court for prejudicing the outcome of a trial. So that's where the question about expertise comes in. You know, when we cover these court cases as journalists, we have legal training to an extent, which means that we know what we're doing in the courtroom to avoid broadcasting or publishing something which would endanger the trial. That's not something which, you know, people across the piece have got if they're writing from a layman's perspective online. So yeah, it's a growing thing. We were being filmed outside court sometimes, almost, actually, I would say harassed outside court by certainly a couple of people who were filming for just live blog sites, filming us working. So it's kind of, you know, it's all gone a bit meta. Yeah, it's a weird world.
It is a weird world, isn't it? And to me, it feels like a world in which accurate voices that have expertise, voices that are trained, are more necessary than ever. Fact-checking is more necessary than ever, but also kind of people who can articulate complexity and nuance, which is something I think all four of you do, whether it be in terms of news reporting or commentary or satire, however you write it. We only have time really to finish up, and it's a shame there are so many questions, but we're already 5 minutes over where I said we'd stop. We were meant to stop the session at 9:15, and I really am going to draw a hard line at 9:30. So what I think I'm going to do is just finish by asking each of you for a last thought, no more than 1 or 2 minutes, about that question title that we set you at the very beginning: what is the point of journalism? And where you think, we asked you beforehand to do a retrospective of your career, but where do you as a journalist feel like you're going from here onwards? So what is the point of trained, careful, responsible journalism? What does it do? And where do you see your way forward as the kind of journalist you are. And I'll take that in the order that we started. So, Rafael, can I throw that to you for a short comment? Just an easy question to finish up.
Yeah, of course.
Easy.
Well, it follows on, I think, quite naturally from what Judith was just saying, but also, I think the really important point that Esther made about at these moments of crisis where it just becomes incredibly difficult to draw a distinction between your participation in the society as a citizen and your professional obligation to somehow be this sort of neutral medium through which just fact and truth will somehow communicate itself to people. Now, I would like to believe, and the reason I first got into journalism was both sort of incredibly selfish in the way that I had the experience of getting an inside track on what was going on, and I found it exciting, and I didn't want to go back to being sort of, in quotes, a civilian who had to rely on the media to know what was going on. I'd much rather be the media finding out what was going on. But also there is a sort of high-minded ideal in there somewhere as well, which is the belief that there is actually a truth, and that for a democracy to function, people are entitled to know what it is. And therefore people have to have the job of finding it out and faithfully reporting it. And, I still think we're very lucky, certainly in the UK, that is still possible. I've worked in countries where it's not, or where it's incredibly difficult. So, that it's a very banal thing in a way. I think that is a democratic function that we have as journalism. In terms of how much harder it gets when you feel the constitutional processes that uphold the democracy are shaky, or you have leaders, whether it's Netanyahu, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it was, this is a glib comparison, but not unreasonable, I think, Boris Johnson in his time here, who have such an incredible facility for just raw deception and manipulating the actual institutional structure of democracy to spread deceit, that just writing down what they say and reporting it is participating in a dishonesty. And that's an incredibly difficult line to navigate. And I think just in the last couple of years, that's the single hardest thing I found about reporting journalism, is how do you say the Prime Minister lied and make that a factual statement? And so I could go on about this forever. But so that for me, from now on in, understanding how we carry on doing what we have got used to doing in a democracy, when it feels like the structures of a liberal democracy don't afford us the benefit of the doubt or the space that we used to have as journalists to do that. Answering that question for myself and as much as anything else will be informing what I do over the next few years. I don't know if that made any sense at all. Someone nod if it did.
It made complete sense.
Okay,
it made complete sense. Very high-minded as well, as you say. No, but thank you, and thank you for continuing on, because we know from your work what a personal toll that has taken. So it's appreciated. Judith, over to you.
I'm not sure mine's as high-minded, really. But although I would endorse everything that Rafael just said, I think, what my work has ended up becoming, it wasn't really what I set out to do, although I'm not sure I had a plan really when I began. But it's become particularly over the last 10 years, really work that's largely focused on telling the stories of individuals who I think wouldn't otherwise have had their voices heard. So giving agency to people, very often ordinary people who found themselves in the public eye through no fault of their own, so bereaved perhaps through public tragedy, but not just bereavements. We've talked about Hillsborough briefly, the long justice campaign there, giving voice to those people, giving voice to victims of sexual abuse. I've done quite a few of those stories, the Rotherham and Rochdale grooming stories. These are people who've said to me that having the opportunity to not just to tell their story, but to be believed and to be given airtime and coverage has validated their experience when for so long nobody was listening. And it's amazing how many people that applies to. So I've found that very rewarding. That's the area that I've continued to develop. It's what I want to carry on doing. And it's a very basic thing too. It's storytelling. It's human storytelling, which is I guess probably was the plan. That is why I got into this. I like all of the aspects of this career in the same way that Rafael does. I like getting access to things that I wouldn't have otherwise had the privilege to see or to do. But I also just like telling the stories, writing and broadcasting and telling the stories of the people I meet. So if I can keep doing that for a bit longer, I'll be happy.
Fantastic. And of course, that individual focus also gives us a lens on broader society. I think it was Primo Levi who said, when talking about the Holocaust, you know, the story of one Anne Frank can be more powerful than the story of 6 million, because people understand an individual. So thank you very much for your work and for joining us tonight. Hugo.
To the purpose of journalism, I don't know. I mean, journalism is lots of different things these days, and more so than it used to be. But I'd just say that most people aren't listening most of the time to anything. And I mean, to anything. Even at the moment, you go out on the street and you ask people what's going on in the Middle East, an awful lot of people really won't know to any level. I often think the role of journalism, whatever sort of field you're in, is to be the people who are there when people decide they want to start listening, the people they can trust and go to. And that does involve perhaps, you know, writing about a lot of stuff that no one else is going to be interested in, knowing they're not going to be interested in it, just simply because you're keeping the process going, you're keeping the institution going. The institution of journalism is the broad establishment institution of journalism is so very important. You know, the extent to which it's like it's an organ of our culture. It's an organ of our environment. Just to be this reliable voice that can be there, that people can turn to when they want it, and doing that in the knowledge that a lot of the time they're not going to. It's still very important to keep it going. For myself, I feel incredibly blessed. I have the sort of career that is beyond what I could have dreamt of when I first thought about being a writer or a journalist. So I'm very, very happy to sort of keep doing it. I'm enjoying doing more radio. Conversely, I also dream about getting back to writing features, doing a bit more sort of, not if not reporting, then reportage. I'm never happier than when I've got sort of 3,000 words to play with, or 5,000 words to play with, rather than 800 words or 900 words, as is my norm. So one day I'll get back to that, but not yet.
Well, we'll look forward to reading some of that more long form journalism, and also listening to, I think there are people in the Zoom room and watching online who listen to Times Radio.
Good.
And if you don't, I hope that listening to our speakers tonight gives you a taste, and you will listen to all of them broadcasting as well as reading their work. So again, thank you very much for joining us, Hugo. So I'm going to give the final word to Esther.
Well, I suppose, I've always understood the power of words, and I always thought that that's exactly what, we're here to hone those words, to make them clarify the world, and to understand the repercussions of words, even in their edited form, to think about, whether it's, it can have powerfully positive outcomes, and sometimes, less positive outcomes as well. I suppose what I came up against in terms of the last 3 weeks is where words are not quite up to the task, and that was a kind of shocking experience. Of course, without making any kind of analogies, there are people who've discussed these kinds of moments in Jewish history before, where words were not adequate to the task, or even, people, other writers saying that words shouldn't be, were not only inadequate, but, it's kind of the end of that kind of use of words for describing things that are indescribable. So I suppose that's kind of a moment of humility, to see that the tools of our trade sometimes can't quite function in the way that we always were confident that they could. But on the other hand, immediately afterwards, to think, well, how do you repurpose them, and how do you think carefully about how you're using those words in a way that does do what our job is, which is to explain and clarify what's going on.
Well, we don't have words to say, really, as you said, what we want to say to you, because words like, we wish you strength and courage seem to mean very little, but we do, and we are thinking of you. And I think there is a Jewish family, and there is also a family of journalists who have a small sense of what you're going through and send you strength. And I'm very glad that there are outlets like Haaretz and reporters who are telling the stories, because I know as a reader, I find it very important to have the things I'm thinking framed into words, but also to be given the information that will then help me articulate to other people a deeper understanding of what's going on when you are faced by some of this rhetoric from people who actually have very little grasp of the complexity of the situation, but rely on polemic. So it's moments like this, I think we're especially grateful to you as journalists, to all of you as journalists. I want to say on behalf of the audience, thank you. And I want to say on behalf of our emerging journalists that this was a kind of masterclass, really, not just in terms of a political conversation, but in terms of what it takes to build a career and how to articulate thoughts. So I hope that some of our emerging journalists listening will appreciate and understand, and who knows, you might come across them in your career. But from us, a big thank you on behalf of Jewish Renaissance. And to the audience, we hope you're going to keep listening. We're covering all sorts of different things over the next few weeks. We're having a slightly lighter week next week. We're going to think about reviews and features and what is the importance of the critical voice. Is the critical voice, and critical in its widest sense, something that is essential within journalism, and what does it do? We will be looking at the art of interviewing. We have Emma Barnett talking about that. We'll be exploring the 24-hour news cycle with journalists from both broadcast and print. We've got Sky News, the BBC, as well as some print outlets, Josh Glancy from The Times. And then we're finishing off, as I say, with a session dedicated particularly to how we talk about Israel, and we'll see what happens in a further 5 weeks. But meanwhile, thank you to everyone, and as I said earlier, chazak v'amatz, strength and courage going forward. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.